welcome everybody to Vibe. Thanks for coming for today's talk with Doug Clark, lawyer, arbitrator, author of Shanghai Lawyer and Justice by Gunboat. Vibe, we've been going for about 18 months now. We support local authors, Hong Kong authors. We have about 36, 37 concessions in the shop now. They include music, authors, artists, local cat and dog charities, rescue charities. So we see ourselves as a community type of shop, and we're basically giving people locally a chance to have an audience with people to sell their wares here. So we've had a number. This is probably our, I think, 16th or 17th presentation actually in that time. So roughly we've been doing one a month, and all been going very well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to just one more thing to mention. Actually, we're going out live on Facebook at the moment. So the cameras are here, and one behind Doug. So if you a bit squeamish about being live on Facebook, then by all means move into a position where you're not visible. All right. Otherwise, I'll hand you over to Doug.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so I've got two books up there on the screen. One called Justice by Gunboat, which is actually an abridgment of a longer book I wrote called Gunboat Justice. But that was 3 volumes and 280,000 words. So publisher decided we should republish it, something shorter and more palatable for most readers. That's the one I wrote myself over about 2 years writing, 2 years editing. And when I was writing Gunboat Justice, Shanghai Lawyer, which is a book by a gentleman called Norman Ullman, who was an American lawyer, consular officer, spy, and various other things in China in the 20th century, was one of the books I referred to and used a lot to get background information. But he'd written it as a lawyer when most of the people he was writing about were still alive, so he anonymized most of the people, changed some of the facts a little bit so that you couldn't work out what was going on. But from my research, I knew most of what was going on and who the real cases were, so I thought it would be interesting to annotate that. So you could say, actually, what he's talking about is this case where this happened. Sometimes he changed the facts a little bit. Illustrate it. So if you get a copy, you'll see I've got lots of photographs in there and footnotes. So illustrate it with the pictures of the people to make it a little bit more interesting so it can come more to life. And so that's Shanghai Lawyer. What I'm going to do today is give you a brief introduction to Gunboat Justice very quickly, just to get you an idea of what the story is about, and some of the mainly about some of the interesting parts about writing it, some of the things that I came across. Then we'll get on to Norman Ullman and tell you more about him as his story. So starting first with Gunboat Justice. How did I end up writing this book? Well, first I am a lawyer. I've been a lawyer since 1990, Hong Kong lawyer since 1996, having come up from Australia where I graduated. I actually studied in Shanghai in the 1980s, where I met my wife over here when we were both at university in Shanghai. We moved back to Shanghai in 2000 after I qualified as a lawyer and lived there for 11 years. So just actually and then I left there to come down here to practice as a barrister, which is something I've been doing for the last 8 years. Just as I was leaving Shanghai, in fact, this is the old Hong Kong Shanghai Bank headquarters, now the Pudong Development Bank on the Bund. I was actually on an April day of 2011 wandering down the Bund. It was actually just like today, a beautiful blue sky, like Shanghai has. It's still a little bit of coolness in the air like we're getting today. It's actually almost like today. And I had some time before my meeting, which was actually in the customs house next door. And so I wandered into the old bank because it's beautiful. And on the entrance is this plaque, which I hadn't really paid attention to before. And if you zoom in, which I will on the next slide, you'll see it talks about Sir Skinner Toner, the judge of HBM Supreme Court for China. And so I'm like, I'd actually studied Chinese history as part of my studies, Chinese language as well. And I sort of knew vaguely that there were foreign courts, but I had no idea what they were. So I thought, okay, let's go and find out more about this guy. So I went back and looked up on the internet, and there was really nothing about what this court was, who it was, not on the internet anyhow. Even when I went looking for books, not many. I mean, eventually I found some, but no one had written a real history of this system. So I thought, okay. First, I'm just about to qualify as a barrister. I was talking to Damien here, who's about to do the same thing, and you have a lot of time on your hands because if you've been a partner in a law firm, you're extremely busy, then you become a pupil barrister for a while, going back your life many, many years back. So I had a lot of time on my hands. So I thought, okay, well, I'll write a history. I'll write a quick history, just as something to do in the next few months. And I did actually. In about 2 months, I wrote 50,000 words after doing lots of research. Sent it to my publisher, Graham Earnshaw Books, if you know him, and he said rubbish, like, yeah, it's too boring, like, make it more interesting. So I said, okay, no problem, and then I wrote for another 2 years of research as I was practicing, going around the world to the British Archives in London, where they have all the actual archives of the British court, over to Ireland, Northern Ireland, with my wife to find some of the judges' papers, in Japan a lot, because there was a Japanese side of the court, as I'll tell you, all over the place to write this book. So for Hong Kong people, I've sort of got some focus on Hong Kong for these talks, because if you're in Hong Kong, you're most interested. One thing I discovered, some of you may know, do you know what the China Station was? Damien does, but China Station was the name of the British Navy fleet that was based in China, and it was a huge fleet. In fact, at one point I read somewhere, it was actually the second largest navy in the world after the British Navy. So if you took two navies, you had the British Navy, carved out the China Station, then you said China Station, second largest navy in the world. Why? Because there were treaties that allowed foreigners to be based in China, as we know, but they were actually enforced by the British Navy that sailed its boats up and down the coast, up the rivers, up the Yangtze River, all over the place. So one of the headquarters of the China Station was here in Hong Kong, one of the major headquarters. They also had one in Weihai Wei later on. So a huge naval presence. That's Tamar. That's the original Tamar, which was a boat being turned into a hulk that was turned into a supply store. Hong Kong Supreme Court actually had jurisdiction over China, or appeals from China, until 1865. So there were consular courts set up in China after the Opium Wars, where any British who tried would go to a consular court, and the Hong Kong Supreme Court had appeals from China and Japan, in fact. And as you can see there, it says the Supreme Court of Hong Kong is the greatest nuisance in the East. Something I still think about very often when I appear before the Hong Kong High Court, because some of the judges are a great nuisance. Any consular or custom house officer who dares to take any measures against the scum of Europe found running goods or levying blackmail or shooting natives in China or Japan is immediately sued in the Supreme Court. That was actually a true case, because a consul in Japan had convicted someone of beating up some Japanese, and the Supreme Court actually found him guilty of false imprisonment and fined him for it because he hadn't followed the proper procedures. So they decided to take power away from the Hong Kong Supreme Court and give it to what was set up in 1865. This court, which is the HBM, is her at that time, Her Britannic Majesty's Supreme Court for China and Japan. And that's an original photo of the original court that was built in Shanghai. Some other photos. It's in the 1930s, so it doesn't look so good in that picture. Probably better to look at the small one, but that's Garden Bridge and some other places in Shanghai. That's the only picture I've found of a hearing inside the actual court, and it made the front page of a cartoon magazine because there were a case involving the quality of sherry. But as you can see, the judges were in their wigs and gowns, the witnesses were giving evidence the same as everywhere else. You could be any British court anywhere in the world. And one picture of the second court, I haven't found a picture of the first court, but again, a total British court, judge up there in his big seat, the royal coat of arms and everything, sitting there in Shanghai. This is what it looked like about 10 years ago, a photo I found because it was part of the old British consulate building that has sort of fallen into decay. Found this photo someone managed to take, and now it's been converted back into this beautiful entertainment venue. It's actually run by the Peninsula Hotel. Originally it was a club for senior officials, but with the anti-corruption campaign that stopped working, so they had to turn it back and hand it back over to the Peninsula. And you can go there for some very nice afternoon tea and drinks and functions there if you want to, if you're up in Shanghai. You can actually walk in now. They don't sort of advertise you can walk in, but if you walk in, no one stops you, and then you can go to the restaurants and cafes. So I recommend it highly. Okay, so what was extraterritoriality, which is what the book was about? In very simple terms, very simple layman terms, every foreigner in China was like a diplomat, meaning that the Chinese courts or the Japanese courts had no jurisdiction over you. If you committed a crime in China as a British person, or Australians included, you were taken to the British court. If you're American, you were taken to the American courts. If you're German, you went to the German courts. In most cases, that was a consular court, meaning a consul was also sitting as a judge, something we don't hear much anymore, but consular court was quite a common term. So the consul would sit as a judge. Sometimes they were trained as lawyers, sometimes they were not. And that could be problematic when they want, because it would be very rough justice, and why people got convicted of false imprisonment and other problems like that, because they didn't know the law so well. So the countries had no jurisdiction. It's a very peak 18 countries had extraterritorial rights, and actually in Shanghai there were 21 different courts operating and legal systems technically operating in the same city. So Germans, everyone's subject to their own law. Most had consular courts, and what I wrote about in Gunboat Justice is the British and Americans actually set up formal court systems. So the British were the first in 1865 with the Supreme Court for China and Japan, which had total jurisdiction over all of China and Japan and actually Korea. Either at first instance, if it was a big enough case, so murder and big cases you could bring there, or as an appellate court from the consular courts, because they still kept the consular courts in smaller places so that it was easier to try small cases. But big cases, the court will go on circuit and go down to come down to Guangzhou to hear a case, or Canton as it was called then, or go up north, and the judges will go on circuit to hear those cases. They set up a special court in Japan in 1879 just to try cases in Japan, and that was the main court in Japan, with appeals still going to the Supreme Court in Shanghai. And the Americans, a little bit later, following suit, decided they'd set up what's called the United States Court for China in 1906, and I'll talk more about that when we get on to Norwood Allman, because he was practicing before that court. Why did I call the book Gunboat Justice? This quote from Sir Edmund Hornby, who is the gentleman there in the robe. So when I read both books, I found lots of cartoons and comics to fill out the book and give you whatever the story, the contemporaneous story in there. So if you look at the books, you'll see lots of cartoons and different clippings. That was one I found of Sir Edmund Hornby, who was the founder of the British Supreme Court for China and Japan. Amazing man. He's apparently personally quite charming, but in court he was horrible. He's one of those judges you absolutely hate because he's already decided the case, will tell you what the answer is and tell you to stop bothering him if you're the defendant. One of those people we love to hate. But he also set up the court, really fought to give it power. When people said you don't have any jurisdiction, he said yes I do, and was a really strong character in that way. But he tried a case up in Chefu of murder, where actually he thought the person was guilty of at least manslaughter. They told the jury, you will on my instruction convict, and the jury came back and acquitted, and so he said, well, you've made a big mistake. Unfortunately, the Chinese populace agreed with him that they'd made a big mistake, so they surrounded him on his in his bungalow in Chefu, and he describes standing there with a shotgun in his hand for 3 days waiting to be rescued. He also said he always had a parrot with him his whole life, so I imagine him standing there with a parrot on his shoulder and his shotgun, until he sent his boy down, snuck his boy out being a Chinese. He could well have been older than him, but they called him their boy anyhow. And he found a British gunboat down somewhere, got message to the gunboat that he was in trouble, and they sailed up into the town, landed some British Marines who quickly dispersed the crowd. Leading to this quote, of course, I never tried another British subject accused of killing a Chinaman at an outlying port unless there was a gunboat to hand. So that's why it's gunboat justice. And it's true. Every time there's a challenge to the system, either in China or Japan, they would send in the gunboats. And there's a couple of cases I read that one case, the exact quote was, with gunboat red pole on the way, the popular sentiment seems to have died down. I'm really angry. Yeah, are you still angry? No. So. Then we go to the United States Courts for China. This is the only picture I found of this. This is actually a hearing in Beijing, or Peking at the time. That is Norwood Allman, who we're going to talk about a little bit more. This was a hearing or trial against the Peking University Medical College, which was American, so you went to the American court to sue it. It was in a marine hall, and the Marines actually took the photographs, but that's the judge, Milton Helmick, up there, and some other lawyers. In fact, this guy over here is a British barrister, because foreign lawyers could also appear in every other court by courtesy. And so in the British and American courts, they would often appear in the other courts because it was all in English. But if you spoke another language, you could appear in the other courts, or they would have to get an interpreter. So people did appear. Why did the US Court for China come from? This quote, I won't read it all out, but it's pretty simple that Americans had an extremely bad reputation in China, as this quote from the Secretary of State Root there. Basically so bad that an American girl meant a prostitute. A little bit like in Hong Kong for many years, it's changed now. A northern girl meant a prostitute now, or bakgu if you speak Chinese, but now it probably doesn't, but it means a rich girl who comes to buy luxury goods probably. But American girl meant a prostitute, and so they decided they needed to have stronger court, stronger enforcement. And so in 1906, following the British model, very similar to the British model, they set up the US Court for China. Biggest difference, the most interesting, is the Americans didn't have juries, the British did. Now it's all changed the other way around, and so there's no jury trials in the American court, which is one of the big issues that Americans used to complain about. This is the first judge, a judge called Lebbeus Wilfley. And you think he had a strange name. His brother was called Xenophon. So he was the first judge. He'd been Attorney General of the Philippines very young. Total narcissist, was a terrible judge in terms of he came in, sent people to prison. He shouldn't be sent to prison, just to show his authority. As you can see, the cartoon even has both lawyers objecting to him because that was sort of his reputation. He was eventually forced to resign after 2 years of investigations of him. So a very rocky start to the court. And what's lovely though is from this time there's lots and lots of cartoons that I could dig up out of various different things. China Punch, I think this is China Punch, this one, and some other places that you can put in the book and tell the real story from what people were drawing at the time.
About what date? About what date?
That's 1908. This is actually probably 1907, this one. So just after the court was open, and it actually would be 1907 or 1908, so just after he set that up. Just a little interesting side of the story is I did a lot of research, and I did manage to track down quite a few family members of judges or people who'd been members of the court. And the best story and nicest story I have is I tracked down the great-granddaughter of one judge called Nicholas Hannon, probably one of the most respected judges of all the courts through the whole time. And I went out to Devon. I was in England, I went all the way out to Devon to meet her. And she said, I'm really sorry, I don't think we have that much. We've been through our garage, got everything we have out. And they had a lot of newspaper clippings, which is great. He died in Shanghai. This is his actual funeral in Shanghai. So I think there's a little bit more collected than normal. So they had all the clippings from his funeral, a few other things. But yeah, frankly, as you said, not much. It was still interesting. It was great for me to meet the family and everything, but yeah, not that much until I got to the back end of this book they had. And there were 7 photographs. And I look at them, I think, I wonder where they're from. I realized, no, that's Shanghai. Those are photos of Shanghai. So I've got 2 of them here. They were like this, and they were taken on the old glass plate photos. So that's the sort of photo as you see it. But I thought, I'd like to get this a little bit better quality. So I borrowed them, because originally I took photographs, but they weren't so good. I said, can I borrow them and I'll get them scanned in so I can get high quality scans. So I did that. And this is the quality that you get up to. So that's the same photo, but going into so you have the Marines here, putting him on the camera. But what's amazing about this and so great is that is the acting Chief Justice. So the next judge who's acting as the Chief Justice after Hannon died, you get right in and can actually see him in the face and see the faces of everyone, including the priests and everything, at the funeral. So these are the best quality photos you can ever find because they're a glass plate. They actually don't have any of the sort of points and anything. So I was told that's the highest resolution. Someone who does this profession, this was 1,200, whatever that means. But I thought even if I went to 2,400, you wouldn't get much better resolution. But it's amazing. Similarly, same one. This is why I realized it's Shanghai. This is Nanjing Road in 1900. I saw this photo, and again, that's why suddenly, of course, the Chinese told me. So this is Nicholas Hannon's funeral. And there's his coffin on the back of the horse-drawn cart. This is the Shanghai Volunteer Corps. You've got some Sikh policemen. That's the old town hall. One of the nicest photos I've seen of it. You can see some others. All there. Again, the quality once you zoom in is unbelievable because we come right into the coffin, and you can actually see the faces of the police officers and totally recognisable. So absolutely amazing. So that was a great find. Couple other Hong Kong links in the story. This gentleman's called Lawrence Cantwell. He had a Hong Kong Chinese mother and a British sea captain father. The sea captain seems to have sailed away, as sea captains do, but his mother seems to have been very wealthy, and he kept his father's name, and from wealthy Chinese from Hawaii. So he was actually brought up in Hawaii. And was definitely well off because he used to travel first class. And then he got caught up in America with lots of problems of being half Chinese. He was refused entry a few times because they said you're a Chinaman and whatever, and he had to prove his nationality. He took this very badly, which is understandable, the racism. He ended up going to the UK, where again he was refused to allow to go into the army, even in World War I, even though he was at Oxford because Chinaman. So he eventually ended up in Shanghai again. Wasn't allowed to join the Shanghai Club despite being a barrister and having all the well-off stuff because, again, a Chinaman. He seems to have also been a crook. He was prosecuted for counterfeiting, for running a counterfeiting ground, acquitted, and a few other things. I haven't dug fully into his history, but I did look at him a lot. So he ended up being prosecuted and stuff, but he's an amazing character that I wrote one whole chapter on because of his background. And of course, I had a huge sympathy for him because, of course, I have children who are mixed race, and you just think that how people could treat people like that just because of who they were was appalling. So I have a lot of sympathy for him. One strange thing on this is when I was writing the book, I would contact quite a lot of family members, and Lawrence Quentwell, their family knows he's a black sheep. He was actually convicted of treason by the Chinese ultimately after World War II, and then disappeared. But when I contacted the Quentwell family, they were totally happy to talk about him, sent me this photo, that's from the family. Others said, wanted to find out whatever he did. There's only one person who just like, once I told them they had a black sheep, like, no, can't be him. So sent all the evidence and like, no, didn't send me the photo I was hoping to get. But everyone else was either good, good or bad, loved and very cooperative in writing a book. Just one, same thing. This is if you didn't know, there was a cigar factory in Mongkok many, many years ago called the Inganol Manila Cigars and Cirella. That's the factory. A little bit of trivia, if you go to Mongkok, Yingchong Street means actually Cigar Factory Street, because if you were going to read Chinese, because it was where the cigar factory was. They used to have a factory in Manila and a factory in Hong Kong. This ended up with some big cases in China in particular, because during World War I, the Manila factory was seized by the Americans. It seems probably not correctly, because Mr. Inganol was actually Belgian. His brother was German. His brother was an admiral in the German Navy, but Mr. Inganol was Belgian, so they shouldn't have been seizing his factories technically. Hong Kong, they didn't seize it, but they did put it under some supervision. So at the end of the war, it ends up, his Manila factory gets sold off by the American government in the Philippines to someone else. He still has his Hong Kong factory, so he ends up in an IP dispute over who owns the rights to the goodwill in the different parts of the world. And so that, again, family member sent me that. The only thing he said is, please don't display it anywhere where it's too good quality, because this is the sort of thing that people make reprints of and sell them around because they're so wonderful. So he said black and white's fine. On a screen like this is fine because you won't get quite the resolution you want. But yeah, again, very, very helpful. I'll skip over some of this because I want to get just the sort of ending of extraterritoriality. The Kuomintang got very strong and started heading north, and almost ended at that point because the Kuomintang was a strong government. You cannot have extraterritoriality unless you're militarily stronger than the other side, which is reality. One other thing in Hong Kong judges started going to Shanghai from 1926 to sit on the appeal court there. They set up a new appeal court instead of appeals to Privy Council, so we had Hong Kong judges going up there, and later on you had Shanghai judges coming down to Hong Kong to sit on our appeal court as well. Just quickly, end of extraterritoriality in 1931, Britain and China actually pencil signed a treaty, ready to sign it, and they're all ready to sign it until Japan invaded Manchuria. And then it wasn't in China's interest after that to kick foreigners out. In fact, they wanted the foreign powers to be there. They didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew, because if it was just China versus Japan, Japan was going to win. With foreign powers there, it tempered what the Japanese could do, so the treaty didn't come to end up being signed. That's 37 when the Japanese attack again. Shanghai doomed city was the headline in a newspaper. Then Japan invaded the whole of China, but again, they left Shanghai alone and they left all the concessions alone, including the court. So you had Shanghai became what was called a solitary island, or a solitary island, so the Japanese troops all around it, but they could come in and out, but not just around it, they could actually come in and out, which led to one very strange case of soldiers would be there sitting in their pillboxes defending against the Japanese who could just drive past them. It's like, so it's led to one soldier killing his corporal, and the corporal's name is up on Saiwan War Cemetery actually, because he was buried in China, but they couldn't move the bodies, but they've put a memorial to him up there as well. Tianjin was blockaded as well by the Japanese in 1939 at one point when the British refused to hand over some suspects in a murder. They killed a puppet government leader, so leading to a blockade of Tianjin, something people don't really know about now, but there were literally barred electric wire fences put right around the British concession, and people going in and out were searched and strip searched and everything else. So that's the end of extraterritoriality at the end of 1941, and that came with basically the Japanese invading the the whole of Shanghai, kicking the British out. By the end of 1943, an actual treaty was signed to bring it to an end. And so after the war, people came back to a new Shanghai where foreigners didn't have any special rights except for, I think, the Portuguese, who didn't sign up to 46, but it was not a major thing. The British and the Americans and everyone was out. So that was a very quick run through Gunboat Justice. Can we just now try and get the other presentation? Gary, where will be the...
Yeah, sorry. So I think we've got them in documents. Let's have a quick look.
Yeah, there's Shanghai Lawyer.
Yes, that's the one, isn't
Yes,
it?
yeah. Okay, so now I get going on Shanghai Lawyer. Should we slideshow? That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, as I explained, that was a very quick run through extraterritoriality because we get on to Norbert Ullman, who's a fascinating character. As you can see, it's the Memoirs of America's China Spy Masters, how I subtitled the book. He just called it Shanghai Lawyer. I added the Spy Master part because he did actually end up working for the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA, and certainly was working with the CIA after the war in China, and then after that in Venezuela and some other places. In fact, he tried to run a coup in Venezuela. Should be back there now. Like, he didn't succeed then either. So, so he, and if you read between the lines in his book, he was a diplomat, and all diplomats are spies. So he was certainly doing intelligence gathering when he was a diplomat at different times as well. Fascinating character. He did many things, but he was a lawyer practicing before the United States Court for China. So just a couple of sort of things showing who he was. So that's who he is. That's taken, again, I got this from his family. That's a picture from his honeymoon where he was heading off to Korea. That photo we've seen already when he was sitting in the court in Beijing that had been set up in the Marine Hall. So we explained that, so we skip over that. And let's go to where he came from. So Norbert Ullman came from Virginia. I just found, I didn't find this when I was doing notes of the book, it's one of the things I love to find out if I can, that for his whole life he spoke with a sort of slow, low Virginia drawl, even if he was, even in China and everywhere else, because you wonder what people's accents end up being like as they travel around, they move somewhere, you wonder how he's speaking. So he spoke with this low Virginia drawl from where he came from. He came from a big family, not particularly rich family. Ended up first going down and working in Mexico and learned some Spanish there, which was important later on in his life. But then heard that you could join the foreign consular service. And so he applied and he did a test to become what was called a student interpreter. And the name almost exactly describes what their job was. A student interpreter would be appointed to join the consular service at the very lowest level. For 2 years, all they did was language study. Because they were operating China and America, China and the United Kingdom had their consulates all around China. They had to speak with the Chinese in Chinese because there wasn't the English language ability. So these guys were all expected in the consular service to learn Chinese to a totally fluent professional level so that they could both read and write it and speak it to deal with locals. And so they did 2 years of intensive language training in Beijing. Ullman describes as sort of a strange system where principally it was a Chinese man reading him stuff that he'd have to read back to him, and they'd go back and forth like that before they fell asleep. The old style Chinese learning, but it obviously worked for him because his Chinese was perfect, as we'll find out later. He actually will get there. So his first appointment was the consul in Andong, which is now Dandong. That's right on the border of North Korea. So apparently in this photo you can actually see the border. That was right up there in what was in Japanese occupied Korea when he was there as consul. But not much to do. He said the number one job he did when he got there, he was asked, I think, to clean out the stables or something like that as a young consular officer. He went around the various parts of China for a while as a consular officer. Nanking, that's the old wall city of Nanjing. If you didn't realize, all these cities had walls around them. Tianjin, beautiful now. Gordon Hall, which is gone now, been replaced by the Ritz-Carlton, but you still have that square there. He was there for a while. He actually served, his first time in the court was in Tianjin. You can see here he was the deputy clerk of the court in Tianjin in North China. Jinan and Qingdao. I've used, in Gunboat Justice I used all the old spellings because that's how people were writing at the time, so I thought we should just keep the old spellings. Shanghai Lawyer I haven't always, but on these presentations I do because this is how people were writing to them at the time. So Jinan and Qingdao. Here he was definitely doing spying because there's warlord activity, quite strong warlord activity, and he describes crossing the lines quite a lot. And why would you cross battle lines between armies unless you want to find out what they're doing? He also does describe actually bribing someone to get into the German consulate that had been abandoned in Jinan to find out what was going on. So he's clearly doing some intelligence work at that time, and in Qingdao later when the Japanese occupied it. Chongqing was one of his last consular appointments before Shanghai. You guys are from Chongqing, right? So there's the steps. I think the steps are still sort of there, but not quite looking like that anymore. So, and then he moved on to Shanghai, where he's first a consul in the US consulate, which at that time was right up the top here, and they had a beautiful view down the river, and so he was based there doing consular work. But as he describes, he wasn't a particularly diplomatic chap, so they decided to give him another job, which was a judge on the mixed court of Shanghai. And this is a Chinese court. And it had a Chinese judge, magistrate, who was appointed. It had been set up in the 1860s because the international settlement, all the foreigners are subject to foreign law, but then there needed to be a Chinese court for Chinese law. And originally they'd been taken to the old Chinese courts, but the foreigners complained that basically the Chinese judges would just let people go. So with agreement with the Chinese officials, they set up what was called a mixed court. And why is it a mixed court? Because you have one Chinese judge and one foreign judge, so it's mixed. It's actually something that's happened in a few places. You could even call our Court of Final Appeal a mixed court in some ways from that principle that you bring in foreign judges. Technically, the Chinese judge had the full power of deciding. The foreign assessor was just there to advise and consult the Chinese judge. And that was true pretty much until the 1911 revolution. Sometimes it changed a little bit how much power they had, but pretty much up to the 1911 revolution, the Chinese judge was the main person in control, and the foreign assessor could advise and consult. Of course, advising and consulting when you have armies and navies based in the city can be a little bit more powerful than advising and consulting just by your pure legal ability and skill. So, but in 1911, following the Chinese Revolution, the Shanghai Revolution, the Shanghai Municipal Council took over the mixed court. They actually took it over and ran it themselves, kept the same magistrates, paid their salaries, but now they've been paid by the municipal council. The assessors pretty much became up to be co-judges and had equal votes. So Ullman joined this. This is a picture of the old mixed court. It had this house. This is the prison. You can actually see the bars. And then the courts here were in here. There's a picture of actually Ullman sitting on the mixed court. So you can see he's the Chinese judge here, Ullman there, and he's got another assistant there with him, actually just called Bucknell. And in Chinese magistrates, they always had another magistrate next to them called the standing magistrate, and you can probably guess why if you look at the picture. For some reason, he was required to stand there. But you can see you've got a foreign sergeant of police there bringing the people in, and various mixtures of people. And the mixed court would try all Chinese and foreigners without extraterritorial rights. So, for example, when China entered the war against Germany in 1917, Germans automatically lost extraterritorial rights. Russia gave them up in 1922 after the Communist Revolution, and slowly over time more and more countries did. So they would then go to the mixed court. So Ullman was trying these cases. These cases were tried in Chinese under Chinese law. So he was a Chinese judge, technically assessor, but judge. And he kept the title judge for the rest of his life because I think he liked the idea that he'd been a judge. He was also a Mexican judge for a while. Because he spoke Spanish, he was appointed the Mexican consul in Shanghai, and he actually tried cases as the Mexican consul. I don't know if in Spanish or in English. And here's a case that later came on. It started in the Mexican court. Ullman didn't like trying this. This is against a big gambling personality called Carlos Garcia. He actually makes it into Paul French's book, Devil.
City of Devils.
City of Devils. There. That's a pitch for you there, Paul. Carlos Garcia makes it in there. But he was running the biggest gambling houses in Shanghai, Big Wheel, where all the rich and famous of Shanghai would attend to. The government wanted to shut him down, so they first had to prosecute him in the Mexican court. Ormond didn't like this, so he actually convinced the Mexican government, said, you've got no reason to have extraterritoriality in China. You've got about 6 citizens, all of whom are crooks. So why don't you give it up? And so they did. And so the case then was transferred to the mixed court. And this is a picture of the municipal advocate, who was a gentleman called Robert Bryan, after he'd won the case against these 2 other foreign advocates in the mixed court. Actually, by then it became the Chinese district court. So you had 3 foreigners, 1 prosecuting, 2 defending in the court. Now, Bryan actually spoke absolutely fluent Chinese. So he did all his prosecutions in Chinese in the court. The others would have used interpreters in the Chinese courts. He was a CIA operative, ended up being imprisoned actually by the Communist Chinese after 1949 for a year and a half in Ward Road Jail and tortured quite badly. I have his story if anyone wants it. I've been in touch with family members, and I said, I read somewhere he was CIA, and the family member said, oh yeah, someone told me about that. He was doing crop analysis or something. And I said, no, he wasn't. You can believe that if you want, but no, he wasn't. And he was in touch with Ormond when Ormond was in the CIA as well. He was a family man. He had 3 children. This is again a family picture from Shanghai. Family gave it to me. It doesn't come up too well on this screen, but that's his wife he married, who was a wife of missionary. She'd been born in China, spoke fluent Chinese as well. His youngest son, Bill, who actually ended up working in Hong Kong for quite some time. He's a horseman. He loved riding. This is him riding what's called a China pony. He writes about that. These are horses that are only about this high, and but that was the sort of horse that they had easily in China, and that's the ones they rode around the race courses and everything in China. Avid horseman. Polo player. That's him. That's him, of course, with his. I forget. I'm just trying to think the word. They had a special word for it. Mafu. In Chinese, everyone speaks Chinese. So Mafu, you know, Shifu, the person who. So Mafu is the horse driver, the horse boss. So you have a Shifu, you have a Mafu. He's of course Sikh, and the horse was Dixie Dare. So because he's from the south, Dixie, this horse at least called Dixie Dare. That's somewhere in Shanghai. Again, all from the family. Very cooperative, the Ormond family. They helped me out a lot. So he's playing polo. He's on the front horse there. Picture of him in his polo stuff. He loved playing polo and writes a lot about that as well. In the US court, so that was most of the lawyers of the United States Court for China in 1930. Ormond was right over here. That's his brother who was working with him for a while. That's the judge, Milton Purdy, and some of the other people who make it into both books are all there lined up as the personalities appearing before the court. He did IP. I'm an intellectual property lawyer, so I had a little bit of this in there. He did intellectual property law, doing raids around China, stuff I used to do when I was young, raiding factories and things like that. And he's there telling a story about some counterfeit goods. Interesting. When I come to the end, the IP has an interesting denouement at the very end of his life. One of the most interesting cases he did, getting into some of this, is murder on the Bund. So Ormond acted for this gentleman here, Glenn Hargraves, who's a US Marine, big guy. You can't really tell it from the photo, but I think apparently he's like 6'6", and at the time, huge guy, big, powerful guy. This is a gentleman called Leslie Bell here with his wife. Glenn Hargraves, after leaving the Marines, he got a job with a car company, a car sales company, and so he was able to borrow the cars, because of course having a car is an incredibly expensive thing, and one day he went with his car to meet a young lady who he had a romantic interest in. I don't know if she was romantically interested in him, but she was at least happy enough to go to drive the free car with him. And so Hargrave turns up in the car, take the Londonian trip, and Bell jumps in the back and says, "I'll come along." Because Bell, despite being married, also had a romantic interest in the young lady. So this, of course, led to some friction. So one day, Hargrave was driving along the Bund. You know where 3 on the Bund is, where M on the Bund is? 3 on the Bund, 5 on the Bund, right there, if you know Shanghai. Literally on that corner, I don't know which side of the street, but literally on that corner, he sees Bell, Hargrave sees Bell, gets out of his car to have words with him. Don't know what exact words just but it ended up with Hargrave punching him with his in the head with his left hook. Bell falls to the ground, goes into a coma, gets taken to a doctor. He died later that night. So Hargrave, of course, is prosecuted for murder because it seems like he went out to punch, and Ormond acted for him. Ormond makes this story in the book. This is one of the things about the book why the research was important. In the book, he talks about this being a bar fight, down in Blood Alley where there's a violent and everyone's fighting. He left out the details of there was actually a broad daylight on the Bund, because it doesn't make his client seem as good as he was. But Ormond does some research. The one thing he had going for him is actually Hargrave had obviously planned this, but not to kill, because he actually gone to a police station and asked a friend who was a sergeant, "What will I get if I punch this guy's lights out?" And the judge said, "Probably 2 years." And the policeman said, "Probably 2 years." Okay, fine.
Take it.
Yeah, I'll take it. He'd been in the Marines already, so who cares? Another 2 years, so I'll take it. So that was used to show that he had no intent to really kill. It's just like he hit him too hard. And anyhow, he was convicted of manslaughter instead of murder, which was a big difference, because murder's death penalty. Of course, it can be converted, but whereas manslaughter is a much shorter sentence. I think he got 2 or 3, so he got almost what he wanted. He acted for a number of Russians, the Bolsheviks. So if you remember your history of China, the Kuomintang originally was supported by Russia. And they had a lot of Russian advisors coming in. And only in 1928, or 27 and 28, Chiang Kai-shek decided he didn't want the communist influence of the Russians, and he decided to kick both the communists out of the Communist Party members out of the Kuomintang and had some massacres. But he also kicked the advisors out. This led to a number of cases where Ullman ended up acting for the Russians. And here's a report from the Shanghai Municipal Council about how, this is a Russian spy, in fact, Mr. Rover. Oh, he's a journalist, but we all know what journalists are in these days anyhow. Coming back to Shanghai, and you'll see mention here that Mr. Ullman was there to meet him on arrival in Shanghai, and when we arrested him. So he was there acting for his Bolshevist clients. This is another very interesting case where Ullman was involved. This, you can see there, the mystery man in court. This is a gentleman who turned up in Shanghai, claiming to be French at the time. Turned out, then he went to the French court. The French said he's not French, so he then got passed on to the Chinese courts. He'd been arrested for espionage. I can't remember the specific charge, but he'd been arrested for espionage. You can see this is like saying, who is he? This is his picture here. 2 of them actually, sorry, I'll come to that. And anyhow, Ullman got involved because he had 3 clients who decided to break him out of prison. So he's in a Chinese prison up in Wuhan, in Hubei prison. And they went up to Wuhan to break him out of prison. And it's hard to work out exactly why they decided to do this. It's not so clear from all the research I've done. The plan was to go in as 3 Shanghai municipal policemen in uniform, then walk out, leaving one of them behind tied up, and say, he swapped that, and then the person who's left behind has to sort of blag his way out or eventually get out and say, well, I'm not the guy you want. They got caught for that and ended up being prosecuted down in 2 of them American, one's actually Dutch, so he went to the Dutch court, prosecuted in the US court for China, and Ullman was acting for them. Now, it's a very strange case. Even the facts are strange, but even the conclusion, because Ullman says, we end up having a hearing on race day. Race day means no one's around because everyone's at the races, sort of like doing it on Christmas Eve or something else. And there was a small fine for my clients who were then left Shanghai. It's like, what was actually going on? Were they part of some bigger thing? That's right. And the other story here, you'll see these people look quite similar. One theory was, I don't think it's true because I've done some further researches. This is Eugene Dennis, who was the leader of the Communist Party of America. And one theory was, in fact, he was a member of the Communist Party of America. And at that time, America was not anti-communist. America only became anti-communist after World War II. And some possibility that they were helping out, actually properly helping out, trying to get him out of prison. The Wastrel brother, this is the one story I talked about where I couldn't get a real photo of the Wastrel brother. So Norman also acted for a gentleman, or was involved with a gentleman who was the brother of Metro Goldwyn Mayer founder. And this is one of these real Wastrel brothers. He was convicted of fraud a few times in America, got sent off to Shanghai where he got involved in lots of different fraudulent activities. Ullman talks about dealing with him, trying to get rid of him, and he said the only way he really finally got rid of him was to send him a big bill, which, because then he didn't want to pay it, he'd avoid Ullman. So something we lawyers actually do quite often. It's one of our tricks of our trade. I tracked down the family member, a lady called Alicia May. She's very friendly and very nice, but she wouldn't send me a photo of the Wastrel brothers, so that's why I have to do the other one. She has them. She has the family photos. That's how I tracked her down. She's got them up on websites, and there's one when he's a little kid. But I said, "Do you have one when he's older?" She's like, "No." So wasn't happy that I'd uncovered the black sheep of the family. He also ended up working with MGM to make a movie, or potentially make a movie. So MGM was going to produce Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. Maybe you have a copy here. Do you have one? The Good Earth?
The Girth, no.
No, okay. I don't know. Apparently at the time it was a huge #1 best-selling book by Pearl Buck. And the MGM for the time originally planned to have Chinese actors play Chinese. Can you imagine that? Crazy people, like revolutionary. So they got Orman out to try and find these, and so Orman and his brother Roy were actually doing quite a lot of casting of Chinese actors, doing auditions, getting them in. Unfortunately, they were just a little bit too radical, so we ended up with Paul Mooney and Louise Rayner playing the Chinese leads in The Good Earth. So, with what I don't know, we call it yellow face, I guess. So unfortunately, that was ahead of their times, but they almost got there. I think one of the problems was, to be fair, and Orman mentions, you had to find someone who could both act and speak English. The pretty girls who could speak English, but they couldn't act, or vice versa. So I think that was one of the biggest problems they had in the time. He was a soldier. If you know, the Shanghai Volunteer Corps was a militia run by the Shanghai Municipal Council. He was a member of the American troop the whole time. Go out on exercises, end up being involved in quite a few battles in Shanghai. This is both 1932, where he was, the Japanese were fighting the Chinese. The Volunteer Corps went onto the edges of the settlements to stop the fighting coming into the settlement. So he writes about that, how he'd go out there and watch people. So that's some Chinese soldiers fighting. That's the Japanese having burnt down the North Station. This is a photograph showing up the bombing just north of Shanghai. If you know, that's the Bund area. And so that's just showing how close it was coming to town, the fighting. And that's another burnt out commercial press building in Shanghai. So some serious fighting. Orman was actually based on what was called Windy Corner, which is, I think I've got the next one, shows me more clearly. Oh no, it's not. It's actually based on Windy Corner, which is up near the station, so you can just see how close it all was into the settlement where the fighting was. And so that's just the North Railway Station here. And so they were in positions defending the settlements from the fighting between the two forces. And he talks about that. He was a spy. He actually talked specifically about going out on a mission to find Japanese gun emplacements in the north part of Shanghai. It's up near Fudan University. There's a racecourse up there, Jiangwan, right? Jiangwan, yeah. Jiangwan, and that's some Chinese guns that have been shelled out by the Japanese ships during the war. So that's where he's looking for. He actually talks about that. So why he was out there, hard to say. He was a big club man. He was a member of the American Club. If you know the club here, beautiful club. It originally had three floors of restaurants and actually Turkish baths downstairs in the lower ground floor. Rooms upstairs for gentlemen to stay in and lots of dining. It's now actually become, after the Chinese Revolution, it became courthouses. Then it was empty for a while. Now it's actually the Shanghai Financial Court. So it's been restored to be the Shanghai Financial Court. But he was a member of the club there and did a lot of work with the club as well. One of his most interesting jobs, on top of all that, was newspaper publisher. So he ended up publishing in Chinese the Xunpao, as it's called at the time, but the Shenbao. This is a Chinese language newspaper. It's one of the few independent Chinese language newspapers. In 1937, its publisher, a gentleman Shi, I can't remember his full Chinese name, was assassinated by the Kuomintang on a trip between Nanjing and Shanghai. His young son was 22, inherited the newspaper, and at 22 didn't quite feel like he was ready to be assassinated yet, as you could probably understand. And again, this assassination, because Orman was writing Shanghai Lawyer during World War II, where China was their ally, he plays down, he says, was killed in strange circumstances, but it's quite clear he was assassinated by the Kuomintang, and Orman would have known that. So he took over the paper. Reincorporated, it's in here you can see incorporated in Delaware, so it became subject to foreign jurisdiction, not Chinese jurisdiction, so people couldn't shut it down. And he published this paper all the way through to 1941 as a publisher, which was a very dangerous thing to do. There's the building. You can still go there now. It's got the press as a restaurant downstairs in the old printing hall. It's beautiful, absolutely stunning. If you're in Shanghai, you should go along there. But it was a dangerous job because it ended up with the Chinese authorities putting him on a blacklist, he and 16 other foreign pressmen. Effectively, this is the puppet Chinese authorities blacklist, saying, if you leave Shanghai, effectively you may be picked up. We're going to come after you. He was always, from here on, always armed. He describes going to meetings with his gun in his thing, and going to one meeting with a Chinese person because he had to negotiate with Chinese officials sometimes, and they both scared each other when they both leant forward and they realised both of them were carrying guns. He said most of the meetings were set up, they'd actually have arrangements that the room would be safe and guarded, and you actually wouldn't carry your gun in because it wasn't. But when they both realised they were both armed, it's like, okay, this is a tense meeting. But it also led to, this is actually the Shing Pao building. In front of it, it was bombed 4 times while he was a publisher, and one of his editors was killed. Again, Orman, in talking about the editor being killed, talks about himself. Oh, he just went out for some noodles out on the street, and on the way back, bang, shot in the head. He might have been out for noodles, but it was 4 a.m. in the morning, and he was coming out of a nightclub, but still it was like, and maybe not just noodles, but anyhow. But still, it wasn't a safe place. People were being killed, and he was doing an extremely risky job in doing this. Again, the spy part, why do this unless there's some other deeper job that you're doing behind it? He joined the Shanghai Municipal Council in 1941. There he is, and you see he's proud of his military service. That's him in volunteer corps uniform, and he was a member of the Shanghai Municipal Council for 2 years before the war started, and he was forced to resign. He actually ended up in Hong Kong. I do mention that. So here's some of the assassination and threats we were just talking about. This is the Secretary General of the Municipal Council. He got ambushed in what you'd imagine out of a Hollywood movie. He was driving to work along one of the quiet streets out in the western part of Shanghai, and there's 3 rickshaws parked by the side of the road. As his car came, 3 people jumped out with semi-machine guns and just started blowing away at his car, and just missed him. That's one of the bullet holes. Just missed him with a shot. This gentleman, you can see, is taking some precautions about being shot. This gentleman was beaten up by Japanese gendarmerie, a New York Times reporter, and left. And this is the editor who was killed, Jing something, actually executed. So there were lots of threats going on at that time.
And what year was that roughly?
Around 30, most of these are about 38, 39. So post 37, after Japan occupied the eastern seaboard, it became very dangerous because they couldn't occupy the settlement yet because that would be war. Yeah. But they didn't like it being there, so they put a lot of pressure on everyone in the settlements, particularly because you're publishing a Chinese paper there that is effectively anti-Japanese and anti-Chinese. They want to stop you, and so you get lots of these type of threats. It wasn't actually the puppet governments. Also, just by an aside, being a member of a puppet government was not a very long life expectancy either. I think every mayor of Shanghai was killed within a year, and one by his chef, who chopped him up with the choppers in his own bed. It wasn't a good, safe place for anyone. So yeah, this is when the threats got really bad, 37 through to 41, when he was living in this sort of environment of high pressure. He was a very rich man. His job did very well. There's a picture of his house, which is on Xinhua Lu, now Xinhua Lu. I went to try and find it because most of the houses are still there on Xinhua Lu. Unfortunately, his house was right on the edge of where they decided to redevelop, and it's been knocked down and turned into a big apartment block. You can still see houses look very much like this if you go along Xinhua Lu, but not his actual house. But that's again from the family. Beautiful big house out there. Fancy car, as you can see. So he made a lot of money.
It almost looks like it came from Surrey.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's a very English-looking house.
Well, they are. I don't know if you know that, but if you go to Xinhua Lu, particularly Xinhua Lu, it's all the Surrey-style houses. In fact,
Really?
Even this American. This is an American.
no, this is the international settlement, so it's basically American, British, and basically the Americans in Shanghai were basically British. They were very, very anglicised. They had a lot of English habits. The club, everything was very, very British. In fact, one of the most interesting things I found from this research is it's not just in Shanghai. East Coast, northeastern Americans were until World War II quite anglicised in many, many ways. You still have, I only came across it myself recently, you still have a very high top-end class who still speak almost with a British accent. I went to the one high-end club, the University Club in New York a while ago, and I'd seen on TV, that sort of very high-end American accent of very, very rich. room was full of it, because this is one of those clubs where I asked, how do you join? And my friend who's taking me there, I'm not sure. I think someone has to die, and you have to be, yeah, you have to be rich. I discovered how rich he was when he said we were on Fifth Avenue and I think 56 or something. He said, "Oh, I'm staying with my parents." Oh yeah, they've got a house around the corner. And he said, "House."
Not a flat.
Not a flat, not an apartment, but a house around the corner. So, because he's renovating his apartment, so I'm like, okay. So I got, and so it's very fancy, very nice club. But we went up for breakfast about 10 o'clock, because that's when you dine for breakfast, at 9 to 10, and surrounded by all these people who speak this almost English accent. And I hadn't realised. And I told one of my friends who's a professor at Yale, he said, yeah, actually, if you go back and listen to Roosevelt, he spoke like that. It's very hard to find, but if you actually find, the pre-World War II Americans had a whole sort of, group of accent. The high, the rich were very, very English. They played cricket at Princeton until the 30s. And I discovered that because my daughter went to Princeton. I discovered that because I go to Princeton, there's this big field down the bottom end of the university. I said, "That's a cricket pitch." I said, "I don't know." I said, "No, that's a cricket pitch." It's big and circular. They put a baseball diamond in there, but they said, "That's a cricket pitch." And she's like, "I don't think they play cricket here." So I looked it up, and until the 30s they play cricket. And all the Ivy League colleges still play cricket. So a little part of American history you don't know until you So, because post-war it's changed, it's become a whole totally different thing, but there was no problem for them at the time. So he got his beautiful Surrey house. You're right, I went through Surrey, doing some other research for Gunboat. Just have to say, people in Surrey are pretty rude.
Yeah, absolutely.
The rest of English, everywhere else you go, everyone's really friendly, and like you go and say, I'm doing some research. Oh yeah, let's dig it out for you. Like I often go to churches to get records. Surrey, I go to church like, person's away. Do you know where they are? Nah.
Stuck up.
Yeah, can you give them a call? Nah. Do you know where the grave is? If they're not here, I can't find it for you.
I can believe it.
Yeah. And even in cafes, when you say, you go, "Oh yeah, I'm just visiting that graveyard over there," and they're like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." Most other places, at least, like, get something.
Normal conversation.
So that's his Surrey house, yes, and that's what they built, and that's what you see all over Shanghai, and a very nice house. He actually ended up, again, he's always very fortunate. He managed to leave Shanghai just before World War II started. He said he had to come to Hong Kong on business, which is probably true. But just before he said, I snuck down hoping to be able to get back in time. But you wonder if that's really true. Because he in Hong Kong he was going to be safer than Shanghai. In Shanghai, all those foreign publishers and people were all interned and tortured and beaten by the Japanese. Some they survived, some, but very badly treated. Whereas he ended up being in Hong Kong, where he did end up fighting with the British Defence Forces. Not so much fighting, he described it, assisting them, because he wasn't a soldier. But he did end up being interned for 6 months until the Americans agreed a repatriation of all Americans who were interned in Hong Kong, and most of them in Shanghai on some ships, so he got repatriated. But so he's in the Stanley camp, and he talks about that in the first 2 chapters.
The PW prison. What does PW stand for?
Where's PW? It must be prisoners. Well, I never actually never seen it. I guess it must be a warning. It must be presumably telling, don't bomb us. So maybe it is prisoners of war or something.
Okay.
The internees, actually, having looked at, you often think Stanley, you think prison. The actual internees were not put in a prison. They're in either the St Stephen's School grounds or the warders' quarters and other things like that. So that's why it doesn't look so bad. The prison was still kept as a prison with the internees, whereas I think in Changi they were actually in the actual prison, which is less pleasant. So, and as Allman describes, it wasn't pleasant, but they weren't imprisoned, so to speak. It's just there's a big fence around, and they had to follow orders and not get so much food, but they could do what they liked during the day. So, but it wasn't pleasant, but it's still
like an open prison.
It was like an open prison. You regulate yourselves, and we'll step back. He does describe saying that the Americans got organised, but the British were so caught up with their class structures. It's sort of like, basically the richer would take, and now we're taking the good stuff, and so he claims the Americans were more egalitarian. Probably true, but he does describe that in the book.
Interesting.
He was repatriated eventually. This is the Gripson, which was a Swedish ship used to repatriate Americans from Mozambique or Goa. So the Japanese would sail a ship down there to Goa or Mozambique because Portugal was neutral at the time. So he's repatriated. In his case, he went through Mozambique, Maputo, and then put on the Gripson. And even this was not particularly safe because here is one repatriation ship taken through the periscope of a submarine. Now that's what the crosses are there for. But it does show, like one false step and you could be in the wrong place.
Dramatic picture, actually.
Camouflage.
That was not the Gripson, that's another one.
The previous one had kind of rudimentary camouflage, right?
I'm not sure because it's still white. I mean, it's meant to be easily recognisable, but yeah.
I think you're referring to the darker panels.
Yeah,
some disruption of the...
Yeah.
Was that due to damage or due to...
No, it is obviously something to disrupt it, but they put the Diplomat on it. And but don't forget, they didn't have an interest in sinking these boats because both sides were swapping people. So I don't think it was like they were actively going out to sink them, but who knows? You get one in your periscope sights at night and you think it's the enemy. Japan did sink a hospital ship in the Australian waters during the war. I don't think on purpose, but it happened. And you could always, and the rules of war allow, if you suspect that even a hospital ship or is being used for military purposes, you're allowed to sink it. It's not like, because that's the rules. And so that's what the Japanese, I think, said with the Australian ships, that it wasn't just a hospital ship they were using to carry weapons, but still dangerous. Even those ships, those journeys were dangerous.
Incredible how the submarine commander or whoever it was decided to take a photograph.
Well, probably because he might have been said, "Why didn't you sink the bloody thing?" It's like, well,
yeah, that's why the crosses.
This is why. Tell me I made a mistake. Well, you see, that's actually a Japanese ship, so it's actually a foreign because there's a Japanese flag. And I just realised so that was probably taken by an American submarine captain.
All right.
Then in the war, he got back to America and he joined the OSS, the Office of Security Services, the forerunner to the CIA. Actually, reading the history of the OSS, it was pretty much a Keystone Cops type operation because they just took in people from anywhere with some ability. But Ullman ended up running counterintelligence. That means stopping people spying on Americans. So you have to have your own spies. And there was a reason for that because Ullman originally had been doing intelligence, and then the British and Americans decided that they would coordinate all intelligence operations with the Chinese under Dao Li, I think is his name, the Chinese intelligence head. Ullman hated him, and Ullman didn't want to run intelligence through Chinese because he didn't trust them. He didn't trust the Kuomintang or anything. So I think he got him put himself into counterintelligence because actually in counterintelligence you can do everything intelligence people can do, but you don't have to report it through to the intelligence people because that's the whole point. Counterintelligence is two separate things. So there was one point where someone in what was called SEICO, the office sharing intelligence with China, was investigating Ullman's counterintelligence office, and he actually wrote a stroppy letter saying, why are SEICO wasting so much time investigating Americans in China when we should be fighting the Japs? But they were investigating because they thought they were up to intelligence gathering rather than. But that's Ullman's personality, and I'm sure that was true. That was what he was doing. He was also probably involved with the support to the communists because America actually gave a huge amount of support to the communists during World War II. If you know the Dixie mission. I don't think he actually ended up going to China, but you never know because a lot of files remain classified, but you certainly would have been involved with his knowledge of Chinese. He wrote a best-selling book, which is here, still selling now, back in print, Shanghai Lawyer. A lot of people after they got back during war and actually on their trips home had nothing else to do, so a lot of journalists, they all published piles of books in 1943 that came out, but his did actually pretty well, and he managed to grow a little moustache in the time in America. There is a picture I didn't put in here, but I did find of him in one magazine where he's giving a speech saying, "We must beat the Japs at all costs," and so that was his message. He came back to Shanghai. This is a photo of Shanghai on August 2, I think, early August 1945. So this was in a newspaper contrasting Japan versus Shanghai. Shanghai untouched by the war, not bombed at all. Whereas, of course, Japan was flattened. Even Hong Kong had suffered a huge amount of bombing, but Shanghai wasn't. That's an aerial photo saying. So he came back to a city that was intact. Of course, it's a city that was now no more foreign law courts, but still a need for foreign lawyers because lots of foreign companies coming back, needing people to work for them, needing people to do for them. So Ullman made a fortune in those 5 years acting for American companies, getting used to the Chinese legal system and dealing with the Chinese legal system. Including, there's one story I tracked down, he did some deal with a bank that was worth $20 million US at the time, which is massive amounts of money now. And the person who was working for Obama, who wrote the memoir, said he swore me to secrecy at the time about what we were doing, and I still have to keep that secret despite everything else. So who knows what he's up to. We find he was working, this is a CIA cable, so he's definitely working at least with the CIA. As you'll say, Ullman and I working for Exim Bank for $400,000 to complete purchase of 15 planes. So he's helping the Chinese government buy planes in China, and you can see Ullman there doing the work. So whatever he's doing it as a lawyer, but he's definitely still in with the CIA quite well. And then just to show you, in his book he tries to come across as some austere, serious type. He was a party man. I've discovered this, I didn't discover when I was writing the book, I just discovered this also from another source I came across. And you can get the idea of this. This is some Flying Tigers. If you know the Flying Tigers were the US Air Force. This is him parting with the Flying Tigers that came out of his personal memoirs. And somewhere else I read, yes, he was a very hard drinking man as well. So he on top of all those other things, he did a lot with the hangover, I guess. But and so those is his memoir. That's him with the Flying Tigers. So eventually, in 1950, the communists take over. And this again, where it gets weird about his life. What was he up to? He was in America on April 26, 1949. Everyone else was desperate to get out of Shanghai, leaving, going on boats, planes, whatever. What does Ullman do? He comes back in. So, and he goes in and he does his stuff, whatever, his legal stuff. Of course, he had his job to run, his firm to run, so that's one good reason. Where it gets weird again is, I can't find any record of him leaving. Everyone else, there's a published record from the Chinese, because they had to get exit visas, a published record saying, exiting, you get permission to leave, and then they'll publish a list of those who've been. It may be there, I may have missed it, but no record of him leaving either. Although the memoir I found about him, talking about him being a hard drinker, does now actually mention that he did get some type of permission to leave, but I don't know what it was. It included paying a very large amount of money. So I think he said he basically sold his house or handed his house over to whoever it was to get out. That's right. All that new information comes from a memoir that I've just been sent by someone who worked with him for a while, and so he gets mentioned that. And the hard drinking comes from that, and the exit from China. But still, who flies in unless they're CIA, and who sort of gets out when your good mates are going into prison, like I mentioned, Robert Bryan, who was his good friend, going to prison by the communists, but you're not in prison, despite all those contacts. So I suspect he was a liaison with the Chinese government from the Americans, even if not CIA, and they knew him, but in his case, he was the official sort of representative to do the talking, and that's how he could get out so well as well. He doesn't talk about a lot of that stuff, so it's hard to know.
At the end of the war, he would have been, about 50, wouldn't he?
Yeah, about 50, yeah.
Yeah, so is there records of him when he passed away?
Yeah, he's got records in California at the Hoover Institution.
Yeah.
I didn't actually get a chance to get there, but I did get in touch with a researcher who went through everything and wrote a PhD, her master's thesis on him, so that's where I got some of that information. I do want to get to San Francisco at some point and just spend a few days trying to really work out what went on there. He became a pundit. He was definitely still doing intelligence work back in America too, because in his files are debriefings, intelligence debriefings of people who were returning from China all through the 50s as well. So he was doing that for somebody. We can't say who. We end up being a television pundit. Here he is where was it? I should have put a mark next to it. The Court of Current Issues. Shall we give aid to Chiang Kai-shek? Norwood Ullman, speaking on television, in fact. So pity you can't get these old TV shows because they're all gone. They were just, some of them just broadcast live and you never got anything, but even if there was a tape, the tapes got taped over, pretty much straight over. It was, you've got to go much later before you can get things. And then I like this. This is the final photo. This again came from his family. This is Norwood in Times Square in sometime in the 1950s. And I like the sign "Out of Town" because I don't think he ever really belonged back in America or even felt he was there. He was always out of town somewhere. China was his country. If you read the book, you'll see China. He loved China. China was the place to be. He would have spent his life there if he could have, but he had to go back to America with the Communist Revolution. I guess he could have gone to Taiwan, but he didn't. And there he is, sort of out of town. Where did he belong? So that is the life and times of Norwood Orman as well. So
Why did he like China so much?
he went there at a very young age, learnt the language. I mean, the one thing very clear from the book you'll see is he was not one of these foreigners who didn't go out and mix with the locals. I mean, he learnt the language as a diplomat. He had to run around, and he got to love the country and the people. And because he could speak the language, it makes a huge difference. I mean, like anywhere else. So.
Does anybody have any questions for Doug? If you do, I'll pass you the mic.
That's the mic, is it?
Yeah.
You must have some.
Just a very quick question on the mixed court and the operation of different courts. Did the English court produce reports? Is there a body of case law from the different courts from that time still existing?
There is. In fact, the British court was amazing. I cut it short, but the reason I could actually write Gunboat Justice and Justice by Gunboat was the North China Herald was the official gazette of the English court. So all the way through from 1865 to 1941, all the major cases were reported often verbatim, particularly up until about the 1920s, because this was your real life sleaze. This is your reality TV of the day. Just put a transcript of a court case in there, and everyone's going to read it like the gossip magazine, because most of this stuff was all sleazy, the murders and stuff. So I was actually able to get full verbatim transcripts of a lot of cases and go into them. So the quotes I have in the book, every quote in the book is actually a quote from a source. I'm not making any of them up, unless I say I am. There's a couple I've had to make up, but most of them are literally straight from what was said in the court from those transcripts, plus the case reports, and plus other background material. But in some cases, like, it's not just the case trial, even the committal proceedings. Like, when we first go to the police court and committal, that's there verbatim. Secondly, the other great thing for the British court in particular was, by pure happenstance, all the records survived. So they had them in the British consulate in Shanghai somewhere, and obviously there were not enough for them to have to toss them out over the years. So we're sort of just sitting in, I don't know where they were sitting, in some storage room. Come the end of extradition, come the World War II, the British were interned very quickly, not allowed access. Then the treaty with China to end extraterritoriality actually said we will keep all records for 10 years. So they then had a requirement to keep them. Then the communists came, so the British were still in that building, but no one would have been bothered. There's about 2 or 3 consular officers in their family, so what's in this basement or what's in storage, who cares about? Oh, they survived World War II. The Japanese didn't touch them, so it was still consular premises, so they didn't touch them. War, they come back. Then the communists take over, and the British stay there right up till 1967 during the Cultural Revolution. Then the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards did invade it, but again, the consulate, and they put up their banners and everything. But what's interesting about the Red Guards, again, shows it wasn't as crazy as people make out necessarily. They're obviously under orders not to touch anything, because the records again survived. You think if they're really a crazy group like we have on some of the streets here, they would have put the torches to them, but they're obviously under discipline, like not. And so then from 67 through to 84, that building just sat empty. 84, China restores diplomatic relations with Britain, and the Chinese just sent it all back, presumably part of the agreement, but they just sent all the books and everything back. And so all the records of that court are sitting in the National Archives in Kew.
Wow. Okay.
So correspondence, so I've been able to get quotes and even case reports. If they're didn't make the paper, there's often full case reports and the correspondence between the officials, so I can actually find out what judges thought about cases, because they've written about it to each other. So everything I've got has come from that. So amazing record. The US court was a little bit harder, not as detailed transcripts, and their records have just disappeared. They were in the British consulate at one point, because at World War II start, the Americans sent them to the British consulate, but then they disappeared. But the British one survived. So 260 big boxes of box files. I didn't go through all of them, but I went through lots of them, and just unbelievably interesting stuff. And so that's why you can write a first person quote book.
A separate related question. Arbitration, was that a popular...
It was, but I didn't, of course arbitrations aren't reported in much, but one thing that did happen more often than it does now is sometimes judges would say, even so I sit as an arbitrator rather than as a judge. But no, but the courts are so quick, you didn't need arbitration. Literally most cases were tried within 1 or 2 months. The quickest I found was the British court for Japan. Its first case was tried in 7 days. a ship had turned up in harbour, lost some things. The purchaser sued, saying, you know, I want my stuff. They said general average. They applied for security for costs, and the judge said, don't bother with it because I'm going to try this case. No, come on, sorry, come on. Yeah, try this case, and he did, like 7 days to judgment. So,
Okay.
so why would you want arbitration if you can?
Exactly. Exactly.
And the big thing, there was no witness statements and all that rubbish we use these days. Just call the witnesses, get them in. So the one thing as a lawyer you'll see is quite interesting. Recalling of witnesses, which we very rarely do now, was quite common in those days because you give your witness, they'll come in, they'll go out, another witness. So it was all very interesting. No problem. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so we'll wrap up there, guys, and thanks for coming down. Yeah. All right.
Okay, see you here.
I'd like to thank Doug very much for a very engaging conversation and very, very educational. Actually, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
In terms of the books, so 2 books, obviously, Shanghai Lawyer, Norwood Ullman. So priced at $200.
Yes.
And can be dedicated to you if you're interested.
Or to someone else if you're interested.
Or to someone else, yeah. Christmas is coming. Similarly, Justice by Gunboat, Doug's own book, which was the first slides we saw. So that's also available. Same pricing at $200.
Okay.
All right.
I'll be here for a
Anything
little
else,
while.
Doug?
No,
Yeah.
that's it. So if you want to ask me anything separately, I'll be here. But I hope you found that interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Doug. Excellent.
And all the people out there as well.
Yeah, yeah.
The thousands on Facebook.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.